Say it again one more time because I'm recording.
Can my friend Sophia come over because she has the coronavirus?
No, she already
had it.
So here's a problem. I'm not sure if it's a problem, but the concern I have is, suppose you haven't been infected or your family hasn't been infected and your friend has had the virus just like I have. We really don't know what it means, as in how long they're continually infectious. So long story short is, it may not be safe for your friend to come over because you could still get infected. Even if you get infected from her and you don't really get hurt and you feel fine, it could be someone else in the family that could get really sick. And that's my concern, is we don't really know enough. I think that if there's a way she could come over and you got socially distanced and wear gloves and masks, you could kind of still hang out and do things. But for the most part, it is better just to keep it within the family unit. And that's probably not what we want to hear, but it's probably a safer thing to do.
You want to tell him to go to hell? Because that's what that's what she's going to tell me. Like I'm the one coming up with these rules. Like I'm not. I'm asking my doctor friends. I asked him. I asked another doctor friend, and then I'll give you an answer. Okay?
How old are you, Julia?
12.
12. Yeah. I have a daughter that's 11, and she's like, just the same. She's the same height as her mom, 5'6". So, the girls in my life are going to beat me up pretty soon. I don't get to do anything. I have no control over my life. However, there are times when they'll listen, and this is one of them. So it might just be safer for her family, your family, and for your friends, for her not to come over. Unless you don't like your dad, in which case you can have her come over and cough on him. Sorry, kiddo.
Get lost. What do you say? Thank you, doctor.
Bye. Yeah. You're such a dick, man. You should be nicer to her.
This is Stand Up with Pete Dominic, episode 101. I have a lot of guests today. Very excited. Glenn Kirschner on Michael Flynn, seemingly getting away with lying to the FBI. Dr. Prakash Gatta on living with COVID-19. Howard Stephen Friedman on his new book about the value of human life. And comedian Christian Finnegan and his wife, Kambri Cruz, join me for a conversation to wrap up the week and much, much more. I'm Pete Dominic. Would you please stand up with me right now? Hello, friends, and welcome to the show. Thank you very much for being here. This show is sustained by and paid for by you, the subscriber. If you aren't paying for a subscription, now is the time. Go to patreon.com/Pete Dominic and sign up for $5 if you listen to this show, especially every day. Who listens all the way through? I appreciate it. I put a lot of work into it. I interviewed a lot of guests, a lot of thought, a lot of time, and I appreciate all of the paid subscriptions that are coming my way. So keep it coming. Go to the paid subscription link in the show notes or the address I just mentioned or PeteDominic.com. Okay, now that is out of the way, you don't hear any commercials. It's all paid subscriptions. Maybe someday, but not yet. I like to try to keep it as pure as I can. This is independent media that you're supporting. The show is about the guests. That's what you like it for. I have thoughtful, interesting, passionate, curious, hilarious folks joining me each and every day, and today is no exception. Big news today, though, because the Department of Justice has decided to drop the case against former National Security Advisor to President Donald Trump, Michael Flynn. Crazy day in news, especially because of that. They also arrested the two assholes that lynched that kid down south in Georgia, as well as more from Tara Reid, who accuses Joe Biden of sexually assaulting her and says that he should drop out of the running. Well, okay, but if Joe Biden's going to drop out, then Donald Trump has to drop out too, right? Fair. Okay, so on the Michael Flynn news, I heard from and read about it from a lot of experts. Neil Katyal, the former acting Solicitor General, he says this is the collapse of the Justice Department. Chuck Rosenberg, former federal prosecutor, said it's not good for the rule of law, it's not good for morale, and it's not a fair outcome in this case. Congressman Adam Schiff says by dropping the case against Michael Flynn, the Justice Department lost 50 years worth of ground in maintaining its independence post-Watergate. Once again, Bill Barr is doing Trump's dirty work. And once again, Barr is undermining the legitimacy of our justice system and the rule of law. Geraldo, whoever he is, what's his title? Geraldo, former talk show host and guy who probably helped deteriorate America to some extent, says, "Congratulations, justice at last. You were cruelly mistreated by rogue FBI agents dreaming of undoing the 2016 elections. They set a trap to frame you and use you versus the president, and now you're free. And the unraveling of the coup attempt versus @real Donald Trump begins. We've lost Geraldo. He's trying to get a retweet from President Trump." So I decided to reach out to Glenn Kirschner late last night, and our conversation is coming up. But you got to stay for today's whole program because a lot of great guests. Howard Stephen Friedman's new book is really fascinating, important, and truly groundbreaking in how it discusses the value of human life. And I highly recommend you get it because I learned so much from talking to this guy. Great guest, Howard Stephen Friedman, who is a Columbia professor and an author, and the author of this new book, Ultimate Price: How Much is a Human Life Worth? Then I check in with our friend Dr. Prakash Gatta, who is a surgeon out in Washington, who is diagnosed with COVID-19 and has lived to talk about it and continue practicing. He gave me an update what it's like in the hospital out there and for first responders. And finally, I check in with Christian Finnegan to wrap up the week and news. And we invited his wife, Kambri, to join us because she has a lot to say about a lot of things. She's a small business owner. Her father is in prison in Texas where there's a COVID-19 outbreak. Fascinating conversation with Christian and Kambri. All that is coming up. But here now is my conversation with Glenn Kirschner. Everything you need to know right now about the Michael Flynn case and the miscarriage of justice right now on Stand Up. So it's Thursday night. I was about to wrap up the show, and I realized I had to talk about this Michael Flynn news, and I was trying to aggregate different takes and opinions and headlines. I said, fuck it, I'm calling the great Glenn Kirschner, and I'm so glad that you were available to talk to me. Glenn, thank you very much for joining me on short notice.
Good seeing you, Pete. I appreciate it.
So the news is that the Department of Justice has decided that Michael Flynn has been mistreated, and the Attorney General who leads the Department of Justice is dropping the investigation against him. Do I have that right?
Yeah, he's dropping the case outright. He's trying to dismiss the case after Michael Flynn pled guilty, and all that was left was for Michael Flynn to be sentenced.
So the final word goes to the judge, just to get the details right. Just because the Department of Justice drops the case doesn't mean the judge necessarily has to. Is that right?
Exactly. And we can start there if you want, which is kind of the end of the story. But Judge Emmett Sullivan is the judge presiding over Mike Flynn's case. I had cases with Judge Sullivan, and let me tell you, he is a lion and a legend of D.C. criminal justice circles. And the one thing that really, I'm going to say, angers him, because I've seen Judge Sullivan angry, is when he gets a whiff of governmental misconduct or shenanigans or injustice. And frankly, we got all three in what Mike Flynn, what Bill Barr is trying to do in the Flynn case. He's basically trying to do Donald Trump a favor, though, by letting his friend Mike Flynn skate after Mike Flynn walked into court, raised his right hand, swore to tell the truth, and said, "Judge, I'm guilty. I lied to the FBI. I knew it was a crime to lie to the FBI. I have no defense. I was not entrapped. And I'm pleading guilty knowingly, voluntarily, and intelligently because I am guilty." And that's not good enough for Bill Barr. And I'm happy to get down into the weeds.
Yeah, so I want to get down into the weeds. But before we do get into the weeds, I just want to have your take tonight on the severity of this news, of this decision. What is the precedent for this kind of a thing? Is there any? And it's hard, Glenn, because words escape us in terms of talking about the impact of a decision so often. And we've seen so many problems with the Department of Justice and with justice in general for this president and his friends. How severe, how big of a deal is this? How would you articulate how big of a deal this news is?
You know, I would say this probably puts a nail in the coffin of the legitimacy of the Department of Justice. At least, I need both hands for my air quotes, the leadership of the Department of Justice, because this is politics, cronyism, plain and simple. This has nothing to do with the rule of law or with some weakness in the evidence against Mike Flynn.
Did we see anything like this with Obama's attorney general? Did we see anything like this with George W. Bush's attorney generals?
I've never seen anything like this in my 30 years as a prosecutor, where you have an overwhelming case of guilt and you have a defendant who walks into court and pleads guilty based on that overwhelming evidence. And then later on, the prosecutors swoop in and say, you know what, we've changed our minds, really for no evidence-based reason, and we want to now dismiss this case and give this guy a walk. And, when we drill down on the evidence, Pete, here's the backstory in 2 minutes. Michael Flynn is the national security advisor to the president. He talks to the Russians on the phone, talks about sanctions, something he has no business talking about. Then he lies to the vice president about it. Then he lies to the FBI about it. Then he walks into court, takes an oath, swears to tell the truth, and admits to the judge, I lied about it, and I knew lying to the FBI was a crime. I'm guilty, Your Honor. Then Bill Barr swoops in and files 20 pages of garbage today. And here is his claim, boiled down to its essence. He said, Mike Flynn didn't really lie. And, if he did, it wasn't really material. It wasn't really relevant to anything we were investigating. And, if it was, we weren't really investigating anything anyway. It was almost over. So for all of these reasons, we're moving to dismiss the case. Let me just read a clip from the Mike Flynn guilty plea to see if Bill Barr's claims hold water, okay? Here's what he said. He agreed to this statement of facts at the time of his guilty plea. It says, the defendant, Michael Flynn, who served as a surrogate to Trump and an NSA advisor to Trump, and ultimately the national security advisor to Trump once he was elected, he made materially false statements and omissions during an interview with the FBI on January 24th, 2017 in Washington, D.C. At the time of the interview, the FBI had an open investigation into the government of Russia's efforts to interfere in the 2016 presidential election, and Flynn's false statements and omissions impeded and otherwise had a material impact on the FBI's investigation. So the evidence that was sworn to in open court at the time of his guilty plea is completely contradictory to what Bill Barr is now hemming and hawing about in his 20-page garbage motion. He can't even come up with a straight-faced, evidence-based reason to dismiss this case. What
about the fact that so many people are making claims, and we talked about this before, and you've been talking about this in your YouTube channel and elsewhere. What about this idea that the FBI set Mike Flynn up?
Well, Judge Emmett Sullivan covered that. He said, Mike Flynn, do you feel like you have any defense to this? He said, no, Your Honor. He said, do you feel like you were entrapped by the FBI? He said, no, Your Honor, I wasn't entrapped. And did you know lying to the FBI was a crime? Yes, Your Honor, I knew lying to the FBI was a crime. This was not a setup. I reviewed the recently released notes by the FBI where they were discussing their tactical approach to Mike Flynn. How do we interview this guy? Do we try to get him to lie? Do we consider prosecuting him? Is one of our goals to have him lose his job? I've had thousands of those tactical discussions with my investigative team before any consequential interview of anybody, whether it's a witness, a subject, or a target. This is what we do. Here's the only outlier, Pete. When they're talking about should a goal be we get this guy fired from his job as a national security advisor, that's not something that we would ordinarily talk about because we're generally not interviewing the national security advisor of the United States, who is now compromised because of the lies he's told the vice president and the FBI. So you're darn right I want them discussing, should we work to get this guy out of a position that is endangering the national security of our country?
When you say compromise, what does that mean?
Compromise means when you are talking dirty on the phone to the Russians about sanctions, things he had no authority to talk about, and then you lie to the vice president and the FBI about having those conversations. Now Russia's got you. They've got compromise on you. They've got blackmail material on you because they know that you told them something that if it's disclosed, it's going to hurt you. So now they have leverage.
And how dangerous of a situation, and there's probably no precedent in this country, is it to have leverage or have compromise, as it's called, on the national security advisor, the, I think, highest ranking national security advising person to the president of the United States?
I mean, it only matters if you care about the national security of our country, right?
Yeah.
Other than that, it's no big deal.
The idea that they asked, should there be a goal to get him fired, reminds me of some of the spies from the CIA that have gotten caught and the FBI in the past. Of course, you don't want them working there anymore if this is what they're doing. Of course, you want them terminated. They're dangerous. They're careless, and they're not doing what is in the best interest of the United States of America, much less the Trump administration, one could argue.
Yeah. Once they have leverage over you, you're done. And you should be done. You shouldn't be in a position where the country is relying on your judgment and your representations to protect us.
So what's the final conclusion here? When will the judge make a decision on this?
So, there's a big dark cloud right now, but I'm always looking for that little bit of a silver lining, and we've got it here, and here's how we've got it. When a case is filed in court, and particularly when a guilty plea is entered, it's the judge's case. The court has jurisdiction. It's not the prosecutor's case. Under Rule 48 of the Rules of Criminal Procedure, the government can file a motion. They can ask leave of the court to dismiss the case, but it's up to the judge. So I'm not going to predict what Judge Emmett Sullivan will do, but he can do one of about three things. He can order an evidentiary hearing. He can say, okay, Bill Barr, I understand you want to dismiss this case. I want people to come in, be placed under oath, and account for what in the world you're doing, why you are now trying to kill a case in which I, the judge, accepted a knowing, voluntary, and intelligent guilty plea. I need more than that 20 pages of garbage that you filed. He could do that. He could set an evidentiary hearing and then make a decision after that hearing concluded. Or he could simply deny the motion and proceed to sentencing, which, frankly, I would like to see him do. Because, again, the government can only ask permission to dismiss a case. They can't do it on their own. So Judge Sullivan could proceed to sentencing and send Flynn to prison, fingers crossed. Or he could end up granting the motion to dismiss. But here's the other little bit of silver lining hiding back there. When a judge grants a motion to dismiss a case, that case can be rebrought, can be refiled in the future in the interest of justice. So come January, when we get a law-abiding president and a law-enforcing attorney general, Michael Flynn can, should, and I would say must be charged with these crimes that have been dismissed for political reasons. So we still have a couple of slivers of hope.
Glenn Kirschner, at Glenn Kirschner 2 on Twitter, and you are now posting on YouTube. You've created a YouTube channel, and we talked about how we're not getting enough coverage about these legal matters now that we've got this pandemic or anything else that's important. How often are you posting on this YouTube page?
I'm posting every day, every other day. Yesterday, I tackled how, Trump is ordering all the workers back into the meat production facilities, basically to get sick and die. But he's trying to do a solid to the executives by saying, you know what? You got coverage. Yeah. I'm going to give you immunity. Nobody's going to be able to sue you or hold you accountable. I mean, talk about wrong all day long.
He doesn't care about anybody, but he definitely cares a little bit more about the wealthy folks than he does working class folks. That's for sure. Glenn, thanks so much for joining me on short notice. Everybody's got to check out and subscribe to Glenn's new YouTube page where he's posting videos almost every day. It's excellent. Great source of information. Appreciate you joining me, pal.
Thanks, Pete. Appreciate you having me.
All right, Glenn Kirschner. Awesome. Check out his YouTube page. Very popular. Excellent commentary. Real smart guy. Tons of credibility. Tons of experience. Good friend of mine. Happy he was available late last night. And also now joining me is my next guest. It's Stephen Friedman. Howard Stephen Friedman. He is a Columbia professor, and he wrote a really, really great book called The Measure of a Nation, How to Regain America's Competitive Edge and Boost Our Global Standing. And his new book is called Ultimate Price, The Value We Place on Life. How much is a human life worth? Individuals, families, companies, and governments routinely place a price on human life. The calculations that underlie these price tags are often buried in technical language, yet they influence our economy, our laws, behaviors, policies, health, and safety. And these price tags are so often unfair, infused as they are with gender, racial, national, and cultural biases. Well, Howard Stephen Friedman lays it all out in this new book, Ultimate Price, The Value We Place on Life. You got to get it. Here's our talk about it. I mean, I joke, Howard.
Take care of my 3-year-olds.
Yeah, well, you have a little kid, but I just before I press record, I was like, how much time do you have? And I could talk to you for 3 hours about this book, which is why people should read it. Welcome to the show. Thank you very much for joining me.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be on.
The Ultimate Price, The Value We Place on Life. I've had a question for a long time that your book attempts to answer, and the question is this, or I guess it's more of an assertion, my thought, my moral view on it. I think I first had this thought after 9/11 and then during the Ebola situation, and now I have this thought a lot. A doctor's life is worth more than my life because the doctor is actually saving lives. And no matter how important my work is, even in my favorite scenario, my highest rating of myself, it's never as important as the doctor who is saving lives every day. How could you argue with that? Can you argue with that?
Well, I will argue with that.
How dare you?
There are many different ways that human life is valued, and it's critical to look at the perspective that someone takes. So when you start asking this question of how much is a life worth, you have to ask, what's the purpose of the calculation? What am I looking at? What's the scope? So there's a space in which, what you said is probably true, but there's a totally different perspective in which the answer is that, no, your life is worth at least as much and probably the exact same amount as that doctor. And we should flesh out one of those different cases.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, let's start with one of the more basic things, which is if you think about our regulatory agencies, the Environmental Protection Agency, the FDA, each one of them does a cost-benefit analysis. This is a basic thing in the toolkit of a regulatory agency. When they start trying to figure out what is the value associated with making water safer to drink or less pollutants in the air, the benefit is saving lives, and those lives are priced equally. Every single person, rich or poor, young or old, is given the same value, about $10 million per life.
That's how the government decides. That's how they come to that. How do they come to that $10 million factor?
So they're using what's called a value of a statistical life. And I don't want to oversell the science behind it. It's an economic calculation. There's lots of ways they get to it. But the key thing about it is they tried at one point to value different lives differently. If you go back to the Bush Jr. administration, the EPA actually did try testing the waters of saying, well, what if saving an older person's life is worth less than a younger person's life? And the public was livid. They called it a senior death discount. They pushed back against it. And to this day, the EPA, FDA, and all the other regulatory agencies value the lives the same. So an economically driven calculation to get that number. But once they have that number, the government has abided by the rule, all lives are valued equally. Okay,
but I probably should have asked before, what is that number attached to? Why does the government need to come up with a figure for how much someone's life is worth?
Well, they're specifically trying to balance the costs of regulation. So when you impose costs to make, let's say, cars safer, or once again, the air we breathe safer, there's costs associated with it to different companies and to the public itself. And they want to make sure that there's at least benefits that balance that off. It's a little difficult for a lot of people to accept the fact that dollar figures are placed on human life, but they're done everywhere. For-profit companies are doing it. Regulatory agencies are doing it. You're seeing it in the court systems. The particular case of the federal government, they're really trying to understand how can they save lives without imposing what they would say is undue burden on companies.
Well, we can unpack that another time because I really want to talk about how that is valued and how they get away with what they do get away with. So you mentioned the Bush administration, Bush Jr., 43, evildoers, whatever you want to call them. So, but it's interesting, that theory and what they were trying to say. And now is that exact same theory is back right now because of COVID-19. We have heard Lieutenant General of Texas, I think the attorney, whatever his name is.
Lieutenant
Governor, forgive me, make this argument. We've heard a lot of pundits on the right, I think, make this argument as well, that older people are expendable is how I'm interpreting it. Maybe you don't agree with my interpretation, but is that how do you hear the argument being made right now about this, what I call false choice of opening back up and going back to work and the cost in the economy versus the cost on human life, especially folks who are older or more vulnerable? Because it's not just older people. It's just anybody with any kind of immune deficiency.
So to your point, this is not a theoretical issue. This is real world. People can live or die based on it. But it's not just pundits. For example, Massachusetts issued guidance for their hospitals that specifically suggested that if they have to choose who gets life-saving support, for example, a ventilator, that they should consider what's the life expectancy of the patient. And they did say, when in doubt, age is a consideration. So they have states that are providing this guidance. On the other hand, though, the Affordable Care Act specifically has a provision that says that you can't make that decision of allocating precious resources based on life expectancy or age. So the fears of the death panel ended up putting in restrictions on, at least for Medicare, how that resources can be allocated.
Grab your mic cord and just pull it. Make sure it doesn't rub on your shirt. It's not a big deal at all, but I just want to limit it. Okay.
I'm going to hold it the whole time.
Yeah, that's fine. So you also talk about in your great and very important new book, the discussion of the terrorist attacks 9/11 and the Boston Marathon bombing and how there were these victim compensation funds. Of course, there were a lot more victims in September 11th than the Boston Marathon bombing, but still, how are they evaluated? And what's really interesting is the same person who blurbs your book, by the way, Kenneth Feinberg, oversaw both of these situations and the compensation. Help us understand how he came to the differences and how the victims were compensated for these terrorist attacks.
Absolutely. So following September 11th, the government created a victims compensation fund, and Feinberg was the special administrator. He was tasked with offering money to the families of the victims so that they would then settle. They would agree to not sue airlines and other groups that could have been held responsible. He created a calculation. The calculation had a minimum value. He said, no matter who you are, no matter how much you are earning, your age, at a minimum, you had to at least be offered, your family was offered $250,000. He was told he had to take economic considerations into account, which is how civil courts operate somewhat. So he had to think about salary, but he controlled what was the cap. He knew some people were earning millions of dollars a year. After all, you look at the people who died, many of them were very high earners. But he said no matter who you were, he's not going to have an assumption that they were earning more than a little over $200,000 a year. So he has this calculation. There's a minimum value. He adds some more to it based on salary, but he controls the cap. And then he says also he's going to add some extra numbers based on the number of dependents. The net result was that some people got paid $250,000. Others got paid over $7 million. Some lives were deemed to be worth 30 times more than others. Well, the public didn't totally accept this.
Right.
They had issues with it.
Right.
And, he responded to it later himself saying within a few years after he had paid them out, he thought it would have been more accepted and it would have been fairer and easier to administer if he had just paid everyone the same. So if the families of the victims all got the same amount of money. Now, to your point, he had the chance to revisit it.
Right.
So move a few more years into the future, the Boston Marathon bombing. Now a fund was created with private money. No restrictions placed on Feinberg as to how he would administer it. He administered it using exactly the instructions that he said he would have liked to have done for September 11th. He paid the families of the victims the same amount of money, regardless of who they were, how old they were, what they were earning, or any other factor.
Really important, that chapter in the book, and trying to understand that and using those concrete examples. What a weird job that guy has had to be in charge of these funds that are created as a result of devastating terrorist attacks, and then divvying them out, and constantly, by the way, dealing with the victims' families as well, and trying to do what's right. A lot of this bioethics.
There's a huge ethical component to this, absolutely, and I try to keep coming back to this in the book itself, because to me, the fundamental point about understanding how human life is valued is when lives are undervalued, they're underprotected. If there's a high price tag put on a human life, if I know that an accidental death will cost me $10 million, then as a company, I will invest a lot in safety. If I think that the cost is going to be a small fraction of that, I'm not as incented to try and protect lives. So it's a huge point, and ethics plays a role in this.
Well, if that's the case, that if lives are undervalued, then they are underprotected. I mean, can you prove that? Well, because just to throw it in there, I don't value poor people at all. They offer nothing. All they do are a drag on the economy. They're pitiful. They're pathetic. I have no value for poor people. So I don't know why we would give them any protection.
All right. I know you're taking a straw man on me, but thank you for that that extreme example. Let me give some examples.
A very common held belief, though, whether people are willing to admit it or not. We have a real problem with undervaluing, underappreciating, and not understanding poverty.
We do. And if we don't go beyond looking at income-based valuations of human life, then that super strong opinion you just expressed, which I know you were joking about, will actually have impact. So let's take a real-world example. Mm-hmm. Bhopal, India, 1984. Terrible accident happens. About 4,000 people are killed. 1989, the settlement comes in at approximately $60,000 per person killed. $60,000. Now, you come to a more recent case, the Toyota acceleration case. Less than 100 people in the United States were killed. The settlement, not only judgments to the individuals, but also
Toyota automobiles, something wrong?
Automobiles, yep. Toyota cars, the acceleration. They had an acceleration issue. They were well aware of it. They did not take the steps to repair it. Well, as a result, less than 100 people were killed. The settlement came out to approximately $20 million per life. Okay, wow. So there's a difference in time, 1989 versus just a few years ago. But the main difference is related to the fact that this was happening in the United States.
Versus India.
The message that gets sent, of course, to companies is, if you're going to have a dangerous product, you better not sell it in the United States. On the other hand, it also encourages companies to put less measures into safety if they're selling it to perhaps a poorer country which doesn't have as much legal protection.
Undervalued, underprotected. Yeah.
Undervalued lives are underprotected. Yeah. And we see this constantly. You brought up, I think, a straw man case about earlier, but I'd love to dig into it more because even our justice system sees this.
Right. You write about this, both the civil justice system and more importantly, potentially the criminal justice chapter, which you discuss, something that a lot of people don't realize, that justice is not blind, that the way that people end up in situations that they end up, it's not a set of choices. And so how do you value the life of a murderer or a rapist or someone who might have been wrongfully accused or someone who's in, maybe prisoner has been accused of a lesser crime, drug possession or something.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, we can see this through all different parts of the criminal justice system. You can look at the amount of time and effort invested in different cases, and we can get to one of those in a second. You can look at the outcomes. For example, vehicular manslaughter. It's a crime. It's a somewhat random crime. You're driving a car, you run someone over, they die. Well, if you look at the actual sentencing is much more severe in situations where the victim was white or employed. And sentencing is much lower if the victim happened to be unemployed, black, or male. Now, there's no reason for why the victim should actually play a role in the sentencing, yet it does. And we see this in murder as well. If you look at the death penalty, it is far, far more likely to be applied in situations where the victim is white and the murderer is black than in the reverse. If justice were blind, then race should play no role in these. But these are really very significant statistically factors, and so it's fairly unambiguous.
Why it's really important. You're the perfect person to write this book because you're a statistician and you have this ability to understand the ethics of this situation. I mean, you're a health economist. I mean, that's why it's so important that you're the guy behind this book. You've got all this research at your hands. So what about life insurance? Because this is one that you also read about where we're putting evaluation on our own lives, right?
Yeah, so many of the chapters in my book they're a little removed, right? I'm not managing a victim's compensation fund, and your audience isn't either. I'm not working for a regulatory agency, and most of your audience isn't either. But life insurance is something we can all understand. In life insurance, we have the opportunity to put a value on our own life. And we can look at it by either trying to figure out what is the replacement income. So if I'm not around, how much money would my family need in order to replace the income lost from myself? You can also look at what is the expected need. So how much money does my family need to maintain the lifestyle they would like? The truth is, though, most people, they might think about those calculations, but they mostly look at affordability. How much is the premium to have a payout that kind of feels good? So it becomes a situation where you end up probably not doing those serious calculations, but rather looking to see what can I pay that makes me feel a little bit more comfortable if I'm no longer around.
Right. In reading this book and talking with you, I think, well, it's great. It's a great book. It's super interesting, but it's also really important and could create systemic change if the right people were to read it and hear about the situation and the injustice. There's so much injustice in our country, especially. So while I'm happy to introduce your work to most of my audience, like you said, they're not regulators, they're not policymakers, they're not judges, they're probably not corporate CEOs around the board, although they might be, that last one. Who do you think this book would make the most impact on so I can be sure to send them a copy?
Well, I mean, from an individual point of view, I think the media is critical because to me, raising people's awareness of the fact that lives are being valued all the time, that often these values are unfair, that the lives that are undervalued are underprotected, are all critical. But the last point, which to me is most important, is when we see injustices, we being the public, that we should challenge that. And there's a lot of examples in the book of when injustice was identified and the public responded. I respect very much the fact that if you take the time to explain technical items to a lay audience, not only they will understand it, but they can act on it.
Let me ask you about how private companies, for-profit companies, put price tags on people's lives, because I think that's one of the greatest injustices in our country, which has got this form of capitalism, which I personally find so corrupt and so immoral, and clearly I've profited from myself. What about these private companies and how they look at our lives? Toy makers, the alcohol or tobacco or oil industry, gun makers.
So if you take any particular industry, if they present some risk to the public, then they have to do a calculation. The calculation looks at what are the costs of reducing those risks and what are the benefits. And let's take an example so it's not so theoretical. Cars are easy, right? We all understand what a car is, and we all understand that you can add more and more safety mechanisms to a car. As the car company spends more money to make their car safer and safer and safer, well, they might be reducing the number of sales. All right. So the car company has to decide how much do they spend in safety versus the benefit. Well, one of the benefits is reduced injuries and deaths from the people who are using the cars. That seems like a good benefit, but they have to put a price tag on it. And the price tag usually comes from civil courts. So they try to look and see how much do they pay in civil court. And if it's a major, major amount, they're more incented to make their cars safer. If they don't have to pay so much, then they have less incentives. And this is why that Toyota acceleration case is so important. Once you start sending a message to car companies that they're going to have to pay tens of millions of dollars per preventable death, they've got a huge incentive to make their cars very safe. If it was only 10,000, they wouldn't care.
And they have some kind of insurance policies, big companies, for big lawsuits. Is that how it works?
Well, all car companies are going to have some types of reinsurance plans built in. All right, They have to have that in order to stay viable. But they're also constrained, right? We have the regulatory agencies who require minimum standards. And by requiring that, it says that no matter who you are as a car company, you have to at least hit these check marks. Car companies, of course, will try to lobby to maybe have those regulations changed. One of the textbook examples is Ford Pinto.
Yeah, why? What was that? I don't remember. I mean, I know people make fun of that car and those who had it, but what happened?
Well, it's an interesting case. So basically, back in the early 70s, Ford was trying to introduce the Pinto car. Regulators were considering increasing the safety requirements at the time. Ford was aware that they had an issue with their bumper that could lead to excessive accidents, mortalities. Well, they were able to develop a cost-benefit calculation, which showed that it was not going to be cost-beneficial to make their car safer. And in that cost-benefit analysis, they put in what was the expected cost of the extra deaths and injuries associated with not making the car safer.
Wow.
Mother Jones, by the way, put an amazing article out in 1977 that really garnered so much public attention, it shifted the whole perspective of how the car industry thinks about valuing human life. And it raised what was the safety standards.
And that is what your book is going to do.
You nailed it. So my dream is,
ultimate price, the value we place on life. Everybody has to get it. Get 2 copies, give to a friend. Your ultimate dream?
My ultimate dream is having a public that's empowered to push back when there is injustices. And Mother Jones did an amazing job in that article of pointing out the injustice, galvanizing the public, and making positive change.
Well, journalists have throughout the time been heroes. Your book is a work of journalism, and I wonder if you learned anything when you were researching this book. What were you most surprised by, if anything?
For me, it's a little ironic. I've studied these fields for many, many years, but I was still very shocked by the level of inequality. To understand that it's pervasive. We see the September 11th Victims Compensation Fund, the 30X amount, but the truth is, had Kenneth Feinberg not required a minimum payment and not capped the top, we easily could have seen 100, 200 times. These days, if you earn minimum wage, you earn about $15,000 a year in the United States, but we have CEOs of companies earning hundreds of millions. So the incredible range in inequality really is what shocked me. And when you see it going across the board, into the justice system, into the civil courts, that's what really surprised me, the scale of it.
All right. So my final question is one that's, it's somewhat related to your work and your book, but I'm kind of obsessed with this issue right now. And I think it's really important. I think that you have an educated opinion on it. If you don't think you do, then, I still want to know what you think. You mentioned Toyota and you mentioned Ford and you mentioned the valuations and how they consider the lawsuit issue and so on if this or that happens. But we know that there's been numerous corporations, big corporations and companies that throughout our life, not only here in our country, but every other country in the world, that has known that their product was dangerous or even deadly. And they went ahead with it and they got rich off of it. And sometimes they got caught and sometimes they didn't. Sometimes it was a slap on the wrist. Sometimes they were put in prison. But what we're seeing right now, there's a really interesting phenomenon happening, dangerous thing in our country, which is these conspiracy theorists and their concerns about any number of things, especially vaccines or climate change and so on. We know that companies do bad things. We know that they get caught. I just get stuck with this idea that folks think that there's a whole bunch of people, hundreds in fact, that are behind some dangerous conspiracy to profit and that they're going to get away with it. We almost always find out that a crime was committed or that they knew something and hid it. We almost always find out. It doesn't mean there's always justice. It probably rarely is. But what do you make of all of these conspiracy theories and how, in my opinion, they're becoming so pervasive that we elected a conspiracy theorist who's constantly perpetuating these and the things that they believe and why they believe them? Do you think about this at all?
I think about it mostly because a good friend of mine, Arthur Goldwag, wrote some amazing books about conspiracy theories.
Okay.
And so, that's over coffee. We brainstorm about it. I think some level there's this growing distrust very much in the American public against science. And once you start with that, you start having a lack of trust in not just the science, but having an objective set of facts. There's an old phrase that used to be around, which was, you're entitled to your opinion, but not your facts.
Right.
The idea that we have this common set of things that we can agree upon. I think that there's a lot less of that now. And to me, that's troubling because when you can't agree on basic facts, you can't really push the conversation. It also reminds me of basically Groucho Marx's line, who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes?
Really well said. You'll have to put me in touch with that guy. I'd love to interview him and get familiar with his work. It is so great to catch up with you, Howard. Howard Stephen Friedman, how much is your ultimate price, the value we place on life? It asks the question, how much is your life worth? And it's such an important question and a really very important book. I hope it sells a lot of copies and wins a lot of awards because that more and more people will read it. And this is such an important conversation for every single person to be having. Thank you so much for joining me again. Great to see you.
Thank you very much. It was really an honor.
I always love when a guest say that. It was really an honor to talk to you, Pete Dominic. It was really an honor to be on your hit podcast, episode 101. What an honor it was. Thank you, man. That guy's a really nice guy and very interesting. I hope that you will get that book. Okay, coming up now, Dr. Prakash Gatta. You heard him talking to my daughter, Julia, at the very top of the show. A cold opening, as we call it in the biz, if you will. Love this guy. We've become very good friends, and I wanted to check in with him, see how he's doing, how the hospital's doing, how his family's doing, and, of course, get his advice for Julia. Here's our updated conversation on all things COVID-19 and what it's like to recover from it and treat others with it right now with Dr. Prakash Gatta on Twitter, by the way, at Gatta Surgeon. And Dr. Prakash Gatta joining me right now, wearing what are the scrubs and the goggles? Still in the office, still at the hospital. Hey, pal.
Still at the hospital. I'm stuck here for a little bit. I have a few other calls and work in general to do after this. So I really appreciate the chance to check in with you guys, with you, Pete, and
I love having you, dude. I mean, you used to call the old show as a listener, and I always loved to see your name up on the board, but I always knew that your phone connection was going to be shit. It was always so frustrating because you were such a good caller with so much to say and offer, and you never had a good phone connection, like consistent. So now we just make these appointments and we talk and everybody loves you. So my first question is, you had COVID-19, you recovered from it, but I feel like the last time we talked, you were a little sketchy. You're like, you know what? I feel like some of the symptoms are coming back. Maybe I'm not over it. So my question is, how are you feeling?
So the unique thing about this recovery is it just seems like a non-recovery in the sense that I have several days in a row, sort of afternoon low-grade fevers, still lots of persisting fatigue, weight loss that I haven't been able to overcome, still at my lowest weight I have been in a couple of decades, not being able to pick that up, which I'm quite surprised, 5 to 6 weeks in. The other thing is there are weeks when there's significant fatigue and there's just random shortness of breath for no particular reason. It just seems to be that the virus is still lingering. And I take it quite seriously, like all of us do. I would say now I definitely have had sort of a moderate version of this virus, not a mild version, because of how sort of persisting the effects seem to be. So, I'm still coming to work. I certainly feel that I have very supportive partners that have supported my sort of re-entry into the workforce. But, there are times that I'm really nervous and worried that I won't be able to make it through the night or operate all night like I used to. So it's been humbling from that perspective. So it has, I think, to sort of face something as severe as this, especially now that we have a lot of us have families, it allows me to help sort of reset, to be thankful for what I have, because we'll lose it at any time.
Right. It certainly has created a unique perspective and kind of shocked your system, your psychological system, in terms of allowing you to appreciate the moment more. That's something a lot of us can relate to, but even more so if you've gotten sick with this or anything. So how is your hospital doing, and how is the state of Washington doing, where you practice?
Yeah, so thankfully, the state of Washington had done the right things early enough. Some would say could have been done even earlier, but that sort of is a political calculus that's very difficult to make. I think overall they've done well, prepared well, stocked up on supplies well, enough to the point where most hospital systems are starting to restart the elective procedures for manifold reasons. One of them is just sort of picking up on the backlog of patients. Our hospital system particularly has done well. Our executives have done the right thing. They've taken pay cuts. They haven't been sort of sequestered in their summer homes in Florida. They've been here on point, coming to work, which we're very thankful for that leadership. There are other hospital systems that have not done as well. And there's some local hospital systems that are furloughing and laying off workers. One of the things that I remember, one of the last conversations you and I had, was you asked me, why is this happening? Why are hospital systems that are now so busy, why are they losing money to the point where they have to cut labor costs and furloughing people similar to an airline company? And the truth is, sort of the sort of the mask of how corporate medicine, U.S. healthcare, and especially the private sector works, is, even in the nonprofit private sector, is that this is primarily an elective procedure plus surgery-based system. So most hospital systems won't have that much working capital. They'll have they won't have that much cash left over to make big purchases, because money that they may possess is more in terms of sort of leveraged assets. So what is their bond rating versus how much on-cash assets do they have? A lot of hospital systems now own real estate. That's kind of a lot of the East Coast hospitals. That's probably the only way they are able to stay in the black. The problem is, when you turn off the spigot of elective procedures, which are highly reimbursed, hospitals get into trouble a lot. And they get them. So as you can clearly see, the last 2 months, 6 weeks to 2 months, a lot of elective procedures have been shut down. The reason there is this concern about hospitals staying solvent is it is based on, a lot of it is 30 to 40% or more, depending on which hospital system you are, is based on their income is based on how many elective surgeries you do. So when that gets shut off from a pandemic or some other national catastrophe and elective procedures are delayed, there is a huge revenue shortfall. So the hospital systems that need to be in place to be able to do patient care and sort of be able to be available for the ER volume of patients coming in with coronavirus and other diseases, they may not have that working capital. So they have to lay off frontline staff in some situations. A lot of back office people, a lot of middle management are sort of suffering with furloughing, getting laid off. I would agree. I would also raise the concern that this is not the time for us to lose that kind of workforce. I know there's been some bailout and some support from the federal government. It's probably not enough, but I think, just like with any natural disaster or catastrophe, my point is, let's say there's an earthquake. Who suffers in a poorer country? It is the people who live in the shanty towns with homes that are not well constructed. This is kind of laying bare what the sort of underbelly and the problem within our hospital system is. So why should we be so dependent on elective surgeries to be solvent? So I think it should bring questions in the way healthcare is distributed, is that why are we so dependent on something that can potentially go away very quickly? As it is
a great point, a great discussion that this country certainly needs to have and debate. And when we talk about healthcare, we don't talk nearly enough about hospital systems. What are examples of elective surgery? I always think of like hip and knee replacements, things that, it sucks that I can't walk. I'm in a lot of pain, but I can go another couple weeks. That's an elective surgery. Maybe I'm thinking about dental. I don't know. What you're a general. What are examples?
Yeah. Those are perfect examples of elective procedures, knee, joint, shoulder surgeries. I don't mean to pick on our orthopedic colleagues.
Yeah.
So, and then I have a lot of elective surgeries too. I do a lot of acid reflux surgery. That is primarily elective, as in people have been suffering from this for years. Even in the midst of this crisis, we've still done cancer operations. We've still done emergency procedures. So that hasn't stopped, although there's some outlets that have sort of pushed for this to say, hey, there are more people dying from not having surgery, cancer operations and chemotherapy haven't been done. I don't think that's true. For most hospital systems have been able to continue to provide that. Cardiology procedures, stenting, a lot of people who get stents, a lot of these are emergencies, coming in with a heart attack, things like that. But there's a lot of other procedures that mostly are elective. They're highly reimbursed by both private insurance as well as Medicare. And this is kind of what hospitals need to keep themselves solvent. But those are typical examples of if you look at our typical operating days, a lot of orthopedic procedures, a lot of sort of general surgery, the U.S. has the highest rate of hysterectomies in the world. Why is that? We don't know. Our European colleagues always look at us and say, you operate too much. This is sort of a productivity-based system where they always sort of call into question the hospitals or the services that are paid according to the number of procedures they do. That's just the reality of how most U.S. healthcare works. Now, there is plenty of U.S. and sort of data to say that whatever we do is based on clinical evidence. I believe that myself, but I'm an example of a productivity-based physician. Our hospital systems have done well, but there's a lot of other procedure-based physicians that their incomes have gone down to zero or dropped a little bit. More importantly, it's the hospitals that have not been able to generate that revenue. So if a physician who does a procedure gets paid $1, typically the hospital has a facility fee and they get paid 3 or 4 times that much. This is to keep the lights on, to hire the nurses, et cetera. So if you're a payor, in this case, an insurance company, you're paying several dollars for an elective procedure or even an emergency procedure. A small fraction of that goes to the physicians, the anesthesiologist and the surgeon, but a lot of it goes to the hospitals. And that is essentially how our hospital system stay solvent. And I think there needs to be some light shed on the fact that this in the long term may not be a sustainable picture.
Let's talk about the pandemic and where we're at right now. I mean, pretty crazy the way that there's such a divide between certainly the federal government, the Trump administration. I would argue a lot of conservative governors wanting to open up versus some of the Democrats and more, quote, blue state governors wanting to be more conservative. And, it's crazy to think that politics is not being instructed by science, by the medicine, by the experts. And we can talk about why that is. But my first question is there a lot of divide and argument in your world amongst physicians, amongst public health experts? Certainly it doesn't seem to be amongst epidemiologists.
It's a great question. I think epidemiologists and most of the physician or provider workforce, including my PA partners as well as nurse practitioners, we're all scientists. So when we look at what the epidemiologists are looking at and recommending to us, as well as hospital leaders, as well as politicians, we believe that because it makes sense to us. So we're evidence-based. I will say that this is a super tough time to be a politician. No matter what party you're in, you're making tough decisions. You have to sort of balance the fact that you have a great population, most of whom are healthy, wanting to get out. That's number one, sort of leisure. Secondly, is the small businesses and the restaurants that are sort of on the verge of collapse. That's a huge concern. And it's it is a election year. So I don't discount these tough decisions, but you're a politician. You make these tough decisions. So ultimately you have to ask yourself one thing. Do I let people out and suffer an uptick in cases and eventually have to shut down again? How much harm does that do to the economy? Or do I wait until I clearly think it's safe to come out or sort of reopen business? How conservative should I be? I don't think there should be political pressure on politicians enough to the point where they open up prematurely. So I think they need to listen to the people that are protesting or feeling that their rights are being curtailed. I think that's a huge concern, especially now with how big the government is and how many things they're doing. I can understand the anxiety, but the economy is one thing. But for the economy to survive and to do well, there's one prerequisite, which is you have to not be dead. You have to be alive when the economy reopens, or you have to be well enough to participate. So the real question is, if you're a politician, now is the time to forget about your reelection, because nobody cares about that. We really don't care who's going to be the next president, who's the next governor. We care about you taking care of us, keeping us informed. And it'll turn out that if you do the right thing, people are going to vote for you. They're going to vote you back into power, as opposed to feeling insecure about some of these decisions that are being made. So I'm sure if you do the right thing, easy for me to say, I'm not a politician, but I would appreciate, the coronavirus task force continuing their daily briefings, hearing from the scientists like Dr. Birx and Dr. Fauci, because that makes me less anxious as a clinician. It makes me think that these guys are still working their way. They're watching out. They haven't sort of taken their foot off the gas pedal.
How would you describe the culture of the community of people that you work with at your hospital and public health folks, nurses, doctors, physicians, maintenance people, in fact, anybody who works in a hospital? How would you describe the mood? Is there? I'm sure there's a ton of anxiety and fear, but I would imagine there's a lot of amazing human moments of connection and ways that maybe aren't even normal in a hospital.
So there's two words that come to mind: is professionalism and selflessness. Now, these people are the most professional people I know. In the midst of an onslaught, they always show up to work, always do the right thing, and they are always. It has reminded us why we're doing what we're doing, because at the end of the day, it's a selfless profession. This is everyone from the bottom all the way up to the top. The reason you're in healthcare is not because it makes you money, it makes you wealthy, it makes you secure. It is because it is your calling. There's a lot of data to support.
Even anesthesiologists?
Especially those guys. I get in trouble if I say anything bad about them, because I can't do anything.
I was the one. No, go ahead. I'm just kidding. A friend of mine is an anesthesiologist, and I give her a hard time.
Think about, because you bring it up, anesthesiologists are vital and critical. Suppose your hospital is overrun with coronavirus patients, and that could still happen. As I said, there's a potential second wave. The anesthesiologists are the ones that have, in addition to the ER doctors and the nurses and PAs, have the skill to intubate people, put the breathing tubes in, because they do that 5 times a day on an elective surgery day. So they have the skill set to do it. And every operating room pretty much has a ventilator. So that was essentially our backup mechanism. So if we got sort of overwhelmed and the ICUs got filled up, we were going to turn the operating rooms into makeshift ICUs, the recovery room units, the PACUs into ICUs. And that's happened here as well as on the East Coast, all over the place. There is one thing that me talking to you gives me a chance to do, which is to salute my colleagues on the East Coast. There's no way for me to thank them for their resoluteness, for their professionalism. I can't imagine myself being in a position that they did. They came to work every day, and sort of the hospitals in downtown Brooklyn, the ICUs in New Jersey. They have sort of met this onslaught with dignity, with grace, in a way that no one has ever taught them to do. They just knew what to do, And at great cost, people have paid the ultimate sacrifice. People have died in the healthcare community. So there is no way it's very rare that I get a chance, through your voice, to be able to thank them for making us proud. And everyone, not just the West Coast, and the whole country is proud of them and what they've basically been through a war.
And you're saying that because of just how much worse it was in New York and the volume of patients and the high loss of life, including amongst the caregivers. I mean, that's what you're referring to, obviously, right?
Yeah. So the close.
I mean, because any doctor, but anybody working in a hospital is in harm's way, is on the front lines. You're just saying it was so much worse in these certain areas.
Yes, the degree of disease that was endemic or present, the prevalence of the disease in New York City, with the way the population sort of stacked up and how close the proximity is, meant that the hospitals were bound to be really hit. And that's exactly what happened. The closest, before it really took off here, we were looking at what was happening in China and looking particularly at what was happening in Italy. The closest to this country the closest to the Italian experience has been what has been happening in New York City. And thankfully, it sounds like things are getting better, but that was a lot for them to put up with. Nothing could have prepared them. No matter how many ventilators you had, it is sort of the mental strain.
Right.
And it's not just the physician putting the breathing tube in, it's the respiratory therapist having to sort of adjust the ventilator, and they have 5 patients and they got to switch out PPE. How do you do that? It's just incredible. There's pictures of ventilator units being outside of the ICU, which also means that the tubing to the patient is a lot longer. That's we call the circuit. The circuit's so much longer. There's a lot of dead space. You got to calculate that based on the patient's height and weight and what the right volume is. And to ventilate a patient prone that is on their belly for like 3 weeks, just imagine how many people it takes to turn that patient so that they don't have bed sores, to make sure that all the lines and IVs are running right. It is sort of an incredible amount of effort, multiple people being in that room for one patient for multiple weeks. So if anybody thinks that things are getting better, this is what we face. The battle will continue. I'm hopeful in the next day or two, I'll be able to donate my own plasma. That gets added up to a blood bank. I have a very rare blood type. So there is, even if it's not used today or tomorrow, it's going to be used. And so the battle will continue for many, many months, and it's not over.
So how much more time do you get?
I think I should hop off. Their call started at 2.
All right. You better go.
Yeah.
All right. We'll touch base again. I want to just keep in close touch with you, and it's great to hear your voice. Great to see your face, and let's talk again very soon, pal. Thank you for joining me again, as always.
Thanks, Pete.
All right.
Thank you, my friend. Keep doing what you're doing, brother.
All right, pal.
We'll be in touch.
Yep. Dr. Prakash Gatta on Twitter @GattaSurgeon. Always love when he joins me, and so do you. Great feedback from you on him, and please follow everybody on Twitter and social media. Tell them you heard him on the program. That means a lot. So you can find all their information in the show notes wherever you're listening to the podcast, whether it be on Patreon, Apple, Spotify, or wherever else. Also, send me an email, standupwithpete@gmail.com, to let me know who you want to hear more of, who you want to hear less of, what you'd like to hear on this podcast. And finally, on today's episode 101, let's check in with my friend Christian Finnegan, who's a hilarious, thought-provoking stand-up comedian who joins me on pretty much every Friday episode. And we had a bonus guest. His wife, Kambri Cruz, joined us as well. She's a best-selling author. She has an amazing story to tell about her life, and she gets into that a little bit as well. She's also a small business owner in New York City, so her entertainment venue, QED, is, of course, like everywhere else, is closed right now, and we talk about that. And we also talk about her father, who is in prison for attempted murder in Texas, and he has 2 years left on his 20-year sentence, and COVID-19 is breaking out in the prison. We talk about that as well. Here it is, Christian Finnegan, and then his wife, Kambri Cruz. All right, as is the last 3 Fridays, and anytime, every Friday, hopefully forever, Christian Finnegan now joins me from his cabin in the woods. We're going to get his wife on in a few minutes as well, because they are up there, and she's a fascinating, really intelligent, really funny person. We'll get Kambri, your wife, joining us as well. Christian Finnegan back for the Friday wrap-up, and hopefully we will, I don't know. Maybe we won't wrap it up. Last week we went off on all kinds of tangents and it was fun. Hi.
Just thin branches everywhere you look.
Yeah, I like them. I like to go out on them and hang on them and see what happens. Now, big change for you this week. What do you want to tell people about the haircut? Why did you make the choice? How did you do it?
Well,
you posted on Twitter. I mean, it was.
I did. You know, I think we all get to this point during the quarantine where we're like, I can't handle this hair anymore. And we happen to have dog clippers laying around for our 2 dogs. And so I decided to go for it. I've been asking my wife for years if I was allowed to shave my head.
Like straight, like really tight, like all the way?
Well, I don't know, really tight.
Buzz
but
cut.
I just I shaved it a couple times when I was in college. The thing is, I have a very weird shaped head. I have a lot of sort of Linus-y type slopes and bumps. So I can't go like straight down to the scalp. I've done that once before, and it did not look good.
Yeah.
I definitely give off a Nazi-ish quality.
Yes, you do. You do.
Now, I used to say it looked like Hitler Youth, but I'm 47, so now it's just
more Anders Breivik. But
yeah, for sure. It's not. And when I took that picture, I was wearing a polo shirt that looked like one of those Proud Boy.
Oh boy, yeah,
shirts.
yeah.
And so I got a lot of people responding, proud of your boy and things like that. But some of them seemed to
Very
be,
good.
They weren't people who followed me. They were just random people who just were excited that they assumed that I must be a neo-Nazi.
What I thought was weird is that in addition is that picture of you outside the Michigan State House screaming. What was that all about? What were you doing at that protest? Just get a new haircut? You change your entire...
Take this lady down. This this bitch governor. I don't know why I use a Southern accent because they're from Michigan.
Well, what do you mean? Well, we've already talked plenty about those protests, and we'll see what happens. But it does seem like the country is moving towards opening up slowly but surely. And it seems like a lot of the states are opening up where maybe I have this wrong, but the numbers are actually still going up. But enough is enough. We're losing too much.
It's hilarious to me, the cognitive dissonance that you can protest the lockdown and also protest having to wear a mask. It's like you think that it would be like, hey, we don't need to stay in our homes because we're all going to be wearing masks and that will mitigate the circumstances. But no, even the slightest inconvenience is tyranny to these people.
Well, just being told what to do.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that from the get-go has always been the American, court d'esprit is just, you can't tell me what to do. You're not the boss of me.
Right.
I mean, everything from us, American exceptionalism in general, and and we're going to talk. I think we're going to talk about this in a little bit. I mean, it's based on this notion, not that we are doing things that are different than other countries that make us exceptional, but just simply by being born, simply by existing, we are exceptional. And that is a lie that we've been able to kind of keep afloat for a couple of generations now because of just military might and financial heft and all that. But in the face of something like a virus, that really starts to reveal itself for the fraud that it is.
It's a really good point, except for even though we have this great military might and the quote strongest military in the world and the best weapons and the best trained people in the military, we haven't won a war since World War II. And we've gotten our asses kicked in Afghanistan and Iraq, and it doesn't really matter how good your military is. You can't beat an insurgency. I mean, we've not really seen that in history. And so
when I don't root against the American military, I don't root against individual soldiers and things like that. I mean, I root against the policies, but I don't root against troops themselves.
I don't root against them, but I generally root against invaders.
Of course.
And I was against all of the mission in Iraq. I saw it as an invasion. I didn't want anybody on either side to die, but I didn't blame the Iraqi people for,
of course not,
for wanting to fight the invaders. That might sound.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I'd love for anybody that hears that fought in Iraq to explain, why that's necessarily wrong. This idea that I have to root for the people because I was, as you were saying, I was born in the same country. No, I mean, be objective. Who's invading who?
Yeah. Well, and it's like the only reason that these wars that we fought in the past generation or two have even been a draw, to the extent that you can call them a draw, or even an arguable win, it's only been because we've just leaned on them. It's just been like the equivalent of like the fat kid in your school just sitting on you. You know what I mean? That like, okay, well, I guess you sort of won the fight because you just sort of like lay on top of me and I couldn't move.
Well, I don't know which conflict that metaphor is.
Policy.
I don't know which conflict that metaphor is representing, because eventually the fat kid gets off and then the war continues, whether it's Vietnam, that's Afghanistan, Iraq. Eventually we leave after we've held and built for a little while, then we leave, and then nothing. All the gains are lost, and you got to feel.
By the way, I say this as a former fat kid, and so all
Did you
love
sit on
to
people?
Fat kids out there.
You sat on?
I never sat on people. I was the fat kid who cried very easily, which was not a good mix. I was sort of the Napoleon complex proving ground.
Ah, buddy.
For all the kids like you who had something to prove, and they had to take pictures themselves, their shirts off, and they were working.
No, that
out,
was not me in high school, bro. I was tiny.
No, by high school, I was just like an arty kid, and I didn't actually get in any physical fights. But in elementary school, I was the kid who, like, if you were a tiny kid with something to prove, Finnegan was there for you.
I'm sorry to hear that, but I do want to watch that screenplay, that movie. You mentioned this American exceptionalism idea. You sent me a great article, and full disclosure, and these segments, I ask you to send me stuff that you're paying attention to, and it's part of why I like doing these segments, because you always send really great articles. And this is from Vox, Zack Beauchamp, who I love. Title of it's The Coronavirus.
Yeah, consistently I will find articles that I find are interesting, and they turn out to be Zack Beauchamp's. So.
Oh, yeah, he's great. I used to have him on the show a lot. I should get him on the podcast. The coronavirus killed American exceptionalism. The pandemic has forced us to face a brutal truth. America isn't as exceptional as it thinks it is, and here's why we falter. I love this article. I thought it was so important for so many reasons, but I think you already even said it. And you look at a chart of the number of confirmed cases, and America, our arc is higher than anybody's. We aren't doing better than anyone. What could be more evidence of, a bullshit premise of exceptionalism than not being able to control this viral outbreak the way Spain, Italy, France, Iran, Germany, China, Canada, Singapore, all of them are better than us, Christian?
Yeah, well, I mean, Americans, we've come to treat exceptionalism as a birthright, as an inheritance. That's something we just have. It's like, no, to the extent that America was exceptional, and I do believe America was exceptional, certainly for its time period when it was born, that it was born of laws and not of sort of monarchic dynasty and things like that. I do think that America was exceptional. Ironically, the things that have made America exceptional over the past, 100, 200 years are the things that the exceptionalists want to get rid of. All the people who scream American exceptionalism to the rooftops are the people who want to get rid of things like, immigration. And, America is exceptional because we are constantly replenishing the coffers of young, hungry people coming to this country. When I say young, I mean young in terms of citizenship. Pockets of people from around the world. It's the only country in the world that was founded on a mindset and not a genetic definition. Do you know what I mean? That it attracts people who want to make something. That was the myth we've told ourselves for, I don't even want to say myth. That was the story that we have been nurtured on, is that America was the place where if you worked hard and you came and you put your nose to the grindstone, that you could better your family's lot in life and your children would be better off than the previous generation. And, there's a certain naivete to that, but I think there's something rather beautiful about that. Well, but of course, as time has gone by and generations, now Americans are 5 generations deep, 5 generations removed from their immigrant, ancestors, they look at new Americans, because they're a different color, they're from a different part of the world than they used to be, because travel was different than it was 100 years ago. They look at those people as invaders, and they look at those people as ruining America, when really what they do is they justify the concept of American exceptionalism.
Very well said. Yeah, I mean, focusing on the immigrant part of America, I think is probably what would make us the most exceptional. But I don't know, man. I have such a hard time looking at American culture and putting it into, any specific thing. I mean, Zack in this article has a great line, and I can't find it now, about how there's no American identity. I mean, we are a very divided, partisan country. And what is American culture? I mean, we have so much diversity of ethnicity and religion and ideology and inequality that I'm not even sure what it means to be American anymore. What it means, we don't take care of each other in terms of our healthcare system. We invade other countries. We have crazy gun laws, capital punishment without universal healthcare, and all the horrific racism. And we saw this horrible assassination, or whatever you want to call it, lynching of this kid this week. I mean, we are so bad in so many ways, and we can talk about pockets and individuals that we respect and that we love. But I don't know. I guess I'm always down on our country and our culture, and I wish I wasn't, but I have a hard time getting around it. I'm not burning flags.
No, I think that the idea of America is still beautiful and valid, but it needs, that sort of thing that Tea Party people say, that the tree of liberty must be replenished with the blood of patriots, or something along those lines.
Tommy Jeff quote, I think.
Yeah. I think similarly, although when I think blood of patriots, I don't think blood, literal blood. I think of blood of new peoples. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That it must be replenished with people who are struggling to make their lot in life. And that is the sort of furnace that keeps America burning.
But he also mentions in this article,
I don't know if that metaphor works.
No, it works. I think it's perfect. Yeah. You keep putting logs in the fire. You have to keep bringing people in.
Yes.
I think you just needed a form of energy. Maybe it could have been coal, could have been logs, kindling. But
these are the gusts of wind that make the windmill propeller turn.
The rays of light. So there's this other point in this piece about how there's so many people on the right, and again, I'm obviously generalizing, but I don't think very, very much, that don't consider left-wing, liberal, progressive people Americans. They're not real Americans. And it's interesting because I would never do that to somebody because of their ideology. We're all Americans. There is no one type of American, going back to my earlier point. But you so often hear the right say they're not, real Americans. And now, God, we're so divided, Christian. And it's like, Ted Cruz and saying, why should Texas help out these other states? We're the United States of America. We have this federal system. If Texas has a hurricane, the rest of the country helps them. If New York has a virus, whose fault are these things? We're there for each other.
What even is a country? What is a country if you're not going to have a universalist attitude in situations like this? I mean, what does being a country even mean?
Right.
It'd be like if we went to war, against the Soviet Union in the 80s or something like that. And, Massachusetts was waging its own war and Mississippi was waging its individual war. I mean, there are certain circumstances, I think Mario Como said something along the lines of is that, and I'm paraphrasing wildly, is that the role of government is to do the job of the jobs that the private sector can't do for itself. And, and those are things like roads and schools, the post office, things like that. We all used to be very non-controversial. And similarly, a pandemic, this is where you need a federal government. Unless we're going to have checkpoints at every state, and we're all going to be in 50 tiny little bubbles, and you can't cross from, Massachusetts to Rhode Island without a 10-minute checkpoint and a body pat down. You have to have a nationwide policy. There's just no other way to do it. And to see these people who somehow, and now you see people already shifting blame to, that the reason that there's coronavirus outbreaks in other parts of the country is because of New Yorkers leaving the city. You can always count on conservatives as sort of almost foreignize New York City as a way, it's like they're one step up from immigrants. You know what I mean?
Well, even if there was some truth to that, so what? But New Yorkers left the hotbed. I mean, they weren't trying to take the virus. It's not. Listen, when I first was watching what was going on in Italy and Spain and how people were leaving the hot zones to get out, or in China as well, you understand that human behavior. You understand wanting to escape a pandemic outbreak. It's also you understand the other point of view of them. Hey, you shouldn't leave there because you're only going to make it worse. That's a tough one, but.
Well, I mean, you have to obviously be proactive, and you have to be responsible, and you have to be overt with your protection strategies, because I mean, my wife and I have to go back to Queens tomorrow. We've been mostly 80% in upstate New York, but we occasionally have to go back to Queens because my there's a business that we have to sell stuff.
But you've been isolating, and you've been following all the rules
from here to there, and we don't fuck around. Yeah, we don't. We're not hanging out in the park and stuff.
I got no problem with that. Do you have a problem with people running in the park without a mask or on a bike without a mask? Hari Kondablu just tweeted. Yeah, he just tweeted, you have to wear a mask whether you're running or whether you're on the bike. And I feel like as long as you're not near other people, you're all right. Like when I go for a walk and I see someone coming the other way, I go to the other side of the street. There's not many people.
There seems to be the science on this is not set.
Yeah.
And there's been a lot of articles in the last couple of weeks is that, this outdoor transmission thing may have been overstated. And as a pressure release, you may have to afford people certain freedom of movement, and there might need to be some concessions just so that people will abide by the main things that help. If you let people run in the park without masks, maybe they won't say fuck it and everybody just pack into parks on a sunny day. I'm not the person. I'm just going by what doctors tell me, and if doctors say wear a mask if you're jogging, then I guess you should do it. But I don't feel like there's been any real clear cut instructions along those lines. It's been a lot of people on Twitter, and a lot of scolds, and a lot of people who just like to say fuck it to scolds.
Oh, I'm a scold.
Appropriate or not.
I was scolding. What was I scolding this week? Oh, I was hardcore scolding the anti-vax movement. I'm done.
Well, yeah, I guess the definition between telling the truth and being a scold is in the eye of the beholder, I suppose.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. Did you see that video?
To me, that sounds perfectly appropriate.
Did you see the lady at the dollar store wearing a mask with the hole cut out for her mouth and nose?
Yeah, and I'm sure in her mind that made her like a rebel.
She's like, it's hard to breathe, so I had to cut this out. Makes it.
See, I took that as her being like I'm following the letter of the law, but not the spirit.
Well, 2 million people took it as that's a dumb lady.
Yeah. I don't know. To me, it felt like hey, look at me. I'm getting around your rules.
I didn't think so. I think that was just a dumb person.
Well, you can never.
Why wear a mask? That's going to be so to make a point and cut out the hole. Oh, by the way, I show you something. I was really not going to buy another bottle of Jack Daniels, and I was at the liquor store, and I was going to buy some cheap wine. I was like, oh, cheap whiskey, and I bought this. Have you ever heard of this?
Evan Williams, of course.
Is it?
I mean, Jack Daniels is not exactly the fancy stuff either.
No, it's not. It's not. But it does seem a step up from Evan Williams. Am I wrong to say that?
No, you are correct.
That was horrible, Evan Williams. Horrible. I felt.
Yeah, I mean, if you're just going to mix it with Diet Coke or whatever, it's probably okay. You might get a little more of a headache or something like that. But yeah, I would not want to be drinking Evan Williams on the rocks.
That's what I was doing. Oh, it's bad. Okay. I wish someone would have told me. I blame everybody. Okay. So I also wanted to talk with you. Everybody should read that Zack Beauchamp article. I'll share that in the show link because it's so good. And I'll try to get him on. The Axl Rose, Stephen Mnuchin back and forth was fantastic. The pandemic Twitter feud no one saw coming. The Treasury Secretary and the front man of Guns N' Roses, Christian, what did you make of this week?
I mean, I never thought there would be a day when Axl Rose was a hero of the left. Because if you were paying attention to Axl Rose in the late 80s, early 90s, he was a bit of a tool. I mean, first of all, not even a tool. I mean, he was, he threatened to beat the shit out of Courtney Love. He was not, I think he beat up Stephanie Seymour, who was his either ex-wife or ex-girlfriend. He was not a good dude. And there was some racial stuff, which was kind of on the fence, a little awkward, problematic, as we would use in the 21st century. But, you know, he was kind of thought of as an a-hole. But, you know, I think people get older. They start to see the world in a more adult fashion. They're no longer just giving middle fingers to any authority whatsoever. And so, but yeah, Axl Rose has been kind of like a fun Twitter follow for the past couple of years because no one can accuse him of being a social justice warrior. Do you know what I mean? Like, somebody like Axl Rose is impervious to a lot of that sort of Ben Shapiro horseshit.
What he tweeted about Steve Mnuchin, and there was at first no context. He said, well, whatever anyone may have previously thought of Steve Mnuchin, he's officially an asshole. I don't know who thought a lot of Steve Mnuchin. He always seemed like an asshole.
I know. People either don't know who Steve Mnuchin is or they think he's an asshole.
But Mnuchin responded to Axl Rose, and he says, what have you done for the country lately? And tweeted what appeared to be an emoji of the United States flag. But, of course, Christian, he made a mistake. And he actually, the Treasury Secretary of the United States of America, the man who signs all of our money, Steve Mnuchin, he tweeted a picture of the
Liberian flag.
The flag of Liberia, which is nearly identical to the American flag, except instead of 50 stars, it only has one. So he immediately deleted that.
Founded by American escaped slaves.
Is that right?
Yes.
I didn't know that.
Former slaves. I don't know if escaped, but yeah, I mean, I don't know why people haven't learned their lesson in terms of social media. First of all, he didn't even tag Steve Mnuchin. He just said Steve Mnuchin's name. So Steve Mnuchin, our Treasury Secretary, during the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression, I would say that this is worse in 2009 or 2008 in the sense that nobody knows where this is going to go.
Way worse. Yeah.
And he is taking time to apparently do searches for his name. Like how, unless somebody else forwarded it to him.
And then acknowledging you're gonna get slammed all day, no matter how good or bad you are at your job. You got to be above that. You can't be responding to that. And by the way, the response, what have you done for the country lately? When I read that, I was like, Stephen Mnuchin passed a tax cut for the wealthiest Americans, and it was horrible for the American economy.
This guy isn't like volunteering for AmeriCorps. He's not out there, teaching flag etiquette to senior citizens.
He's not throwing rolls of toilet paper to people who are hurricane survivors like a real patriot would.
This is a grifter as grifter gets.
Yeah, he's a dick. Fuck Steve Mnuchin and his shitty life choices and his awful wife and everything that he stands for. He is I don't like to call people. Well, I don't like to call groups of people garbage, but maybe individuals. He's a garbage person. About that.
Oh yeah. Well, he certainly is.
It's disrespectful to sanitation workers.
Yeah, so you're right. You don't want to slam garbage in the collection thereof.
No, not at all.
Knows we need the collection of garbage.
Just toss him in the back of a garbage truck anytime because that's all he stands for, as far as I'm concerned. All right, so that's. What else? What a bizarre back and forth.
I would actually like to see a season of Survivor that is completely comprised of Trump cabinet members, because none of these people would survive as middle class or lower class, none of them.
Anything
in the quote unquote real world.
Okay, anything that would require blood and sweat, like physical labor. Like these guys are all most of them born to privilege, except for Ben Carson. I mean, come on, they're mostly born into tremendous wealth, and if they weren't, they've had it for most of their life. And stop the nonsense with they earned it. They weren't, I don't know. I don't know the histories of all of them. I shouldn't say that, but yeah, a hard day's work is.
Yeah.
So for this last,
why does your day earn? Why does your quote unquote hard work earn so much more than the woman who cleans your wastebasket?
Yeah, it's because there's only a few of them, Christian. They're so highly skilled. All right. So for this last one, I think we can get it would be a good time to bring your wife into it, because this last article is about returning to live performance and how venues are going to be able to do that. And seeing as that she owns one, I think maybe this.
Okay, I'll text her and tell her to come out.
All right, so I've bumped Christian Finnegan out of the guest chair, and I brought in his amazing wife, who is an entrepreneur. She's an author. She's a public speaker. She's a small business owner. She's a New York Times bestselling author, but she's got a great, amazing, tragic, however you want to use, whatever you want to words, story about her life. Kambri Cruz joining me now, Christian Finnegan's wife. That's not how you want to be known. I mean, you're your own person.
Not how anybody wants to be known.
There are worse things. Yeah, as far as running down my credits, that's in there.
How did you guys meet?
We met through comedy / blogging. A bunch of women bloggers had gotten together it was the very early days of blogging. We got together for some drinks to meet up to see if we liked each other in real life. And then we decided we did, and that we wanted to keep the party going. So we would go and watch a live comedy show to support another blogger, Todd Levin. And he was doing stand-up comedy for the very first time in his life on a show called Portable Comedy, which was run by Mr. Finnegan. And Finnegan was a blogger as well. So it was all it was just the early blogging days. And, you're reading people and wanting to make sure you showed up in their links column.
What was your blog about?
My life. Yeah, because like you said, it's pretty wild and different and interesting. And honestly, my life... well, for the listeners who don't know what my life is, I'll give you the elevator pitch nutshell.
Please do. I was going to ask you to do that. I don't know how I almost don't want it because it's so rich and long, but everybody should get the book, Burn Down the Ground, your memoir, but go ahead. Give me that pitch.
To truncate it into one sentence elevator pitch seems flippant, but it is what it is. So, so I grew up pretty poor. My mom would object to the word poor, but I'm going to say poor. So I grew up poor in the deep woods of Texas. We lived in a tin shed with no running water, no electricity, no plumbing. We got a trailer that was repossessed. We moved back into the shed. My dad tried to kill my mom. Right? I witnessed it and prevented it. He's now in jail for 20 years for trying to kill another woman. And also they're all deaf. Everybody's deaf except for me and my brother and my cousins. Yeah.
It's
Christian's giggling over here.
Well,
it's just like
he's heard it, but yet it's still, every time you hear it, it's absolutely nuts. And how could, you might be able to relate to one part of your story. I can't relate to any of it, but you can't relate to all.
You would think.
Yeah.
No,
Deep Woods maybe is the most relatable, but not shed.
The thing about the deafness, people think that that's such an outlier, weird thing that not very many people can relate to, but actually it is quite relatable, especially for first generation immigrants whose parents are not native English speakers, or maybe they do speak English, but they haven't assimilated to the culture. And so the hearing child, in my case, or the English speaking American born child, or even first generation or second generation, you're straddling two cultures. You're trying to navigate two identities. And
that's interesting. That's my wife. It's first generation Italian, and I never thought of it that way. Never.
Yeah. Yeah, especially if you're in the interpreter role, which she was often. Yeah,
she was too. That's a really interesting parallel that I never would have thought of. What was the shed that you lived in? Like, what was that like? Was it one small space? Were there rooms in it?
No room, just one. It was actually smaller than this room that we're in. It was just a little square tin shed, which in Texas, tin and sunshine don't go really
You boiled
well.
Every day.
Yeah, we basically.
Oh my God, Kambri, it must give you a really interesting perspective on what you have now in your life.
Well, it's funny when the shutdown happened with the pandemic, and when you really start to come down to the brass tacks, like what's important and what do you need, and when people started panicking and buying up all the toilet paper and all this stuff, I was like, you really don't need much. You really don't need a lot. You can survive on very little, and I'm here as living proof of that. And so I don't know, a calmness isn't maybe the right word, but it was just like, it's going to be fine. You're going to be fine.
Well, don't someone like you, given your story, you probably have a resilience that is, what's the adjective? deeper, stronger, more layered than most of us who are more fragile with this type of adversity. Is that fair to say?
I would say, yeah, especially just also on top of being poor and not having enough to eat and not having modern conveniences, electricity and things like that, and plumbing. Plumbing is great. Yeah.
What a statement.
Really, I know.
So wait, you're for or against plumbing? I'm confused.
I'm all for plumbing.
You like it?
Plumbing
Okay.
is pro plumbing, yes.
So a couple of things that I wanted to talk with you about, being a business owner, specifically of a venue that provides entertainment, and then something much different, which is what's happening in America's prisons. So let's start with the second one first. Tell me a little bit about your relationship with your dad as it stands now. He is in prison where?
Yeah, he's in prison in Texas, which is one of the worst places you want to be in prison in the United States. Texas is very punitive and in a gleeful way. And the thing is I grew up in Texas, and so I get it. I understand the deep feeling of wanting justice. I wanted justice when my dad had originally attacked my mom, and it was pre-Nicole Brown Simpson, pre-domestic violence laws. It was right before the Violence Against Women Act and all that. And so what happened behind a family's closed doors was their business. If you didn't see it, it didn't happen. No, don't ask, don't tell kind of thing. And so I hadn't gotten justice for that major injustice in my life. And so I'd always carried around this big chip on my shoulder, just I wanted my dad to pay. I wanted him to pay for what he'd done. He'd ruined my life. I was not even a senior in high school. And so I ended up not going to college. I got married at 17 to a man in the Navy. And
you had to get permission to marry him, right? Because
yeah, my mom had to sign off. Yeah, on the permission slip. Yeah. Luckily, he was a good dude. I'm still friends with him and his family. But,
oh, good.
Yeah. But years later, when my dad then attacked this other woman and he got 20 years in prison, I was like, great, I finally got the justice I wanted. And now what? And it didn't feel better. It didn't feel good.
Not at all?
No. What felt okay or better, I guess, if you forced me to answer one thing that maybe felt better was that, well, at least I know he was not going to hurt anybody else. That was the upside, that he was safe. He was not drunk or drinking, and he would not be able to drink and not be able to hurt someone. Because the only time he ever really hurt anyone was when he was drinking. And so take that away, and now you're stripping him down to, his raw, true self.
How long has he been in prison? 20-year sentence?
20-year sentence. June will be 18 years.
And you've written so honestly and openly about the situation, the problem, the incarceration in general, how your relationship has developed with him. So answer that last question. How has your relationship changed and developed with him over this time?
Over the time I have come to understand him better than anyone, maybe even himself. And he is, at the end of the day, my favorite quote to use about anyone in prison really is that bad behavior is the language of the wounded. And his bad behavior is a direct result of him being terribly wounded as a child, both physically and metaphorically. He was born deaf into a hearing family. They had no use of sign language, and his IQ is like 165 or some insanely intelligent. And so to not have a language to express that intelligence and be trapped inside this body. And then also they were very poor in Dust Bowl, Oklahoma, and they relied on capital punishment. So he was corporal punishment. Sorry.
I was waiting for you to explain that. I was like, they made a living off of.
Of beating the living tar out of this little boy. And he was abandoned at a deaf school when he was 4. He was left he thought he'd been abandoned at an orphanage. Turned out it was the deaf school. So he was finally able to get this language there, but he was institutionalized from the age of 4 up until he graduated high school. So all these things that kind of fed into what shaped him and what built up his rage and fear of abandonment and all sorts of issues that, that I could point to after writing the book and trying to get to the root of who he was and what made him turn out this way. He has 8 sisters and a twin brother. Some of them are deaf and some of them are not. But all the deaf people in my family, no one had ever behaved like this. So it wasn't just a deaf thing. It wasn't just a poor thing. It was him. Why him? Why did he turn out that way? And so in examining that, I really developed a lot of empathy for him. And just that quote right there, I gave him that quote. I told him that quote in a letter.
Say it again. I want to write it down.
Bad behavior is the language of the wounded. It really speaks to most anyone I can think of, and myself included, that when you're behaving badly, something's hurting in you, and whether it's big or large or outsized, your reaction to it might be outsized or something, but there's something distressing you, and you lash out in different ways.
So I want to hear this. Everybody should get the book. And I have like a million more questions about your life and your relationship with your dad and so on. But I do want to get to this really important issue that we're seeing play out in prisons all over the country. You are tracking the updates of the COVID infections in the prison unit where your father is housed. What is the story? Can you say what prison he's in, or is that not?
Yeah, he's in, Texas Department of Criminal Justice is the prison system, not the jail system. There's a Texas Correctional Jail System, or TCJS, or something like that. So TDCJ is the acronym for the prison system. He's in the Estelle unit in Huntsville. In Huntsville, it's a maximum security, very large institution. I think they've got like 3,500 prisoners at that one building, or that one unit. In Huntsville is a prison town. It's where they execute, the death row inmates.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So
when you say prison town, meaning like that's the biggest employer?
They also have Sam Houston University, but when I think of Huntsville, I always think of Old Sparky, electric chair.
I love it. Sounded like a cute name for a horrible thing.
I know. They actually have a little prison. No, they don't. They have a prison museum, the Texas Prison Museum, which is actually quite good. And but they have Old Sparky there, so you can.
That's
see
its real name.
It's its real nickname, yeah.
But they're not still executing people in the electric chair in Texas.
Now they use drugs.
Yeah, kind of them.
Yeah. But the prisons are a petri dish. Cruise ships, nursing homes, prisons, last places you want to be during a pandemic. And
I'm booked at all 3 of them, actually.
You're headlining. Oh, all right.
I'm doing a prison, cruise ship, nursing home tour if anybody wants to know more about it. So what, and it's, I guess it's kind of obvious as to how it spreads in close quarters, which is what those places all can kind of contain places. But the difference between nursing homes and cruise ships is we feel a lot worse for the people in nursing homes and cruise ships than we do for those who are incarcerated. It's hard to
develop empathy for the inmates, and I get it. My dad's not on the high list of empathetic characters in prison. I feel terrible for anyone who's in there for like a drug related crime, these mentally ill men. Yet I just, on this, sorry to interrupt you, Kambri, but on this show, I interviewed today's episode that you're on. I've got an interview with this guy named Howard Stephen Friedman, who has a whole book about the value of a human life and how all human life is equally valuable. It's a fascinating, really important look into, especially right now. So if whether you agree with it or not, and many people might not, the value of human life, even those who are incarcerated for doing bad things, is
arguably equal. So, I mean, how do you look at how this is being handled, and how are the families of the prisoners, inmates dealing with this?
Well, the thing is about taking care of somebody like my dad, it's like he only got a 20-year sentence. So he's going to get out. And so let's take care of him and rehabilitate him so that when he is amongst us in the free world, that it comes out better than when he went in.
Right.
And that's not what's happening. And then now you've got the pandemic happening, and it's a really volatile situation in that they're all in lockdown. And lockdown ostensibly keeps them safer from contact and close, the 6-foot rule and all that stuff. Ostensibly, that should help them, except that they don't have soap. A lot of them don't have soap.
Jesus.
Soap and water. Yeah. To wash your hands. You got to wash your hands. Sanitizer has always been a banned
there's alcohol in it, and they would drink it, some of them.
Right. And then they did issue them masks, and the masks are basically like cloth underwear type, cotton masks. And they're
not very effective masks.
Not very effective. But if they're not seeing anyone other than their cellmate and the guard who comes by to check on them, you could say that would be adequate. The problem is that they're shuffling inmates around. They're saying they're not, but my dad and other family members, that I'm on a Facebook group for that particular unit, and family members are all giving the same anecdotal evidence of their inmate relative, their inmate loved one, talking about how they're shuffling the sick ones from wing to wing, and just like keep them isolated in one wing. Why are you bringing them into a wing that has no evidence of sickness? And now you've brought in these sick inmates. So they're shuffling them all around. They're moving them around. But also lockdown is just a very severe, mentally taxing way to be. Right now, they've been in lockdown for over 3 weeks, which is starting to push on some mental buttons right now. Sure. Especially because they're not being fed adequately. My dad has been writing about they get these things called Johnny sacks, basically sack lunches. And on this prison group that I'm on, all the family members are all saying about we've been sharing the letters that they're sending about these Johnny sacks, that my dad, his last couple of letters are saying that the bread was moldy 3 times out of in 2 weeks. He's gotten molded bread. Some of them, their food is still frozen. It's actually frozen. He's gotten a tablespoon of peanut butter and 2 pieces of bread, the bread being moldy and the peanut butter being dried and hard, a tablespoon. Now he's 6'2" grown man. That's not enough calories. And then to have it be inedible
Kambri, that's absolutely horrific.
It's horrific. And then it's continuing. That's the thing. It's going to,
how can you, what's activism like? Like, can the families work together to create change? Do you have to get to policymakers? I mean, how does any even subtle change occur?
Exactly.
What leverage do you possibly have? We're going to, what are you going to do?
Yeah, they band together, right? And we've been doing Twitter, hashtag Twitter. What do you even call that? Just like where everybody just tweets the same hashtag at the same time. We launched this campaign, all calling Governor Abbott's office, Governor Abbott being the governor of Texas.
He's a great guy.
Yeah. And you're screaming to no one. Right. No one cares. No one cares. And that's what my dad in his last letter has said. He's like, no one out there in the free world cares about us in here. And I told him, no, we care. There are definitely advocates for you. And
I care a lot and haven't done one segment on it. And I'm really I'm thinking that I'm very happy that you're here talking about this so that the thousands of listeners will hear it, because it's always been an issue that I think, they're just so voiceless. And, as you said earlier, that quote, bad behavior is a language of the wounded. Who amongst us can't relate to that somehow? Yeah. And if we really want these people to be rehabilitated and enter back into society, then we actually have to make an effort to do that. So I'm happy to hear you talking about it and counting your voice. It's super important, and people should care for so many ethical reasons. Now,
yeah, and if anyone out there listening wants to get involved with their local chapters there's here in New York, there's the Fortune Society, which works with reintegrating mostly men, but anyone who's had contact with law enforcement and any arrests or whatever, any jail time. The Fortune Society, and then Our Children, HOUR, Our Children, works with women, incarcerated women and their children. So there's lots of groups in individual cities. So you could always find your local group. And I just volunteer to greet guys at the table that some of them have literally just gotten out of prison, and others have been out for a while, and they're trying to get a job, and they're trying to get an ID or housing, just the basics.
It's so hard to enter back into society, and the system is completely rigged against them. So before we wrap this conversation, I do want to change to one more issue, which is you're a small business owner. You've owned QED in Queens for how long? And, how are you making it through a time where you can't open your doors? And what are your thoughts on the future?
One of the mandated closures. QED is one of the casualties of the mandated shutdown for New York, Governor Cuomo.
Do you agree with that?
I do, for the safety of everyone and the health and safety of everyone. Yes, 100%. Okay. What I don't agree with is no relief for business owners on rents. The business insurance commercial policies aren't paying out insurance claims because they're saying that they're exempt from it, that this is not covered. And so it's like, what is ever covered under an insurance policy? I've had insurance pretty much my whole life. I'm almost 50. I've never even filed a claim, so I don't even know how to file a claim. I've never had to file one, and I've been paying my whole life. And it's like, come on, the time I need it the most. You can't help me here?
No, that's not how insurance makes money. Insurance can't make money by paying out claims.
Yeah. So that's one of the struggles, is trying to get the insurance companies to actually have to pay. During Hurricane Sandy, they ultimately ended up having to pay, but not after long litigation and many businesses and homes being lost in the meantime.
Do you think right now that you'll make it? And if you do, will your business come out the same way it went in?
I feel positive that we can withstand it. Yes. Do I want to? Is that's the main question.
Fair enough,
and it's because it's been the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. QED is 6 years old, and Christian says 5 plus. July is when I signed the lease. So we'll be 6 years in July of having lease signing. It is by far the hardest undertaking I've ever had in my life. It's a tremendous amount of stress and pressure and work. And that's partly my own fault, because I did want to do this alone. I've owned venues before where I've been the subletter, the sublease or subtenant, or I haven't even had a lease on a space. I've just used a room, that kind of thing. And I said, if I was going to pour my heart and soul into opening up another performance venue, it was going to be mine and legit and mine only, because I didn't want partners. I've just been burned too many times in the past on that.
I get that.
Yeah. And so, yay, great. I did it all by myself. And so that's one of the best things about owning my own business, is no one tells me what to do. And then the worst thing about owning my own business is no one tells me what to do. I'm like, somebody tell me what to do.
I understand that too. After leaving Sirius for 14 years, like, wait, I'm in control of everything. Yeah. So I'm just going to go outside for a while then.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I do agree with the shutdown. I'm hopeful that when we are allowed to come back, that we can come back. I don't know what it's going to look like. I feel like people are going to be a little afraid to be inside.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
it's the idea is, even if they allow, if the rules change, there's still going to be some rules in terms of probably distancing. And that's going to make it harder for any venue, because you get, every head counts, every drink counts. Right. And so, but even with those rules, are people going to, as you actually phrase it, want to come inside, be next to other people?
Well, and 50% legal capacity is, I'm sure that most venues are going to be reduced by at least 50% by mandate.
Yeah. I wonder how long that would last.
in a place like QED, I think it would be okay. We're a small enough space. And I think at 50%, our legal capacity is 74, 75 and up, you have to have a public assembly license. And so at 74, you cut that in half. That's 37. And our showroom only seats 50 comfortably. So I think I would maybe keep the curtain open, which is this room divider that we have, this that keeps the bar separate from the stage. I think I would just keep that open, keep the space a little bit more open, turn it into a little bit more of a coffee bookshop during the day.
I like that.
Yeah. And to make it a little less of a comedy club, quote unquote.
It's going to cater to creative people that are going to come in there and write and make stuff.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
I mean, it's a scary time for any business owner, certainly of a venue like yours. And but if anybody's going to be able to be resilient through it and make it through it, I think it might be you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Also a breast cancer survivor, too. We didn't even get to that story.
I know. It's
How
like,
do we not include that?
Leave me alone. I've got enough material.
Kambri Cruz, thank you very much for joining me. QEDs in Queens. What else can I plug for you? Is there anything else I want to plug? Is there social media stuff that I should be plugging?
Yeah, if anybody does want to buy my book, it's only available now through Kindle and electronic reading books. Whatever.
Burn down the ground.
Yeah.
Get it.
And QEDAstoria.com, you can make a donation, or if you're local, you can buy books from us on bookshop.org. We have a little bookshop on bookshop.org, and we get a portion of those proceeds. So if you're looking to buy a book,
awesome.
there you go.
Awesome. Thank you very much for joining me. It's so great catching up with you and seeing you. It's been a long time, but hearing your story, I've been following along, and it's a fascinating and important story. I'm glad that you told it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you.
All right, Christian Finnegan, thank you as well, buddy, for sitting in, man. Thank you very much for hanging out. You guys are an awesome couple, a power couple in my mind.
Yeah, man. Finally, get the women out of here. Back to us fellas, am I right?
Yeah, that's right. Let's do the thing where we do is a sausage party.
Make me a sandwich. No, I'll make the sandwiches.
Thanks, buddy. Really appreciate you both joining me. Fascinating conversation.
Thanks for having us.
All right, bye-bye.
Thank you.
And we did it. Who amongst you did the whole 2 hours? Every day, I used to do 3 hours on SiriusXM. People would tune in, they'd tune out. Maybe this is too much. I don't know. Maybe it's I'm spending too much on each podcast. Maybe nobody's listening all the way through. If you're that person, if you listen all the way through every day, if you're keeping up, or if maybe I try to give you a selection of different types of guests and subject matter to listen to as well. Maybe you like the national security stuff, the legal stuff. Maybe you like the more life and culture stuff, relationship things, parenting. Maybe you like the healthcare, economics. I don't know. I like it all. I enjoy it all. So I try to get as much of it as I can on each episode to give you a selection. But boy, this is 2 hours long, and I hope it's worth it. I really do, because it is to me, but I hope it is to you as well. And if it is, please consider a paid subscription on Patreon.com right now. Go to the show notes, hit the paid subscription link, or just go to Patreon.com/PeteDominic and sign up for as little as $5 a month. I will talk to you on Monday. Thank you for listening this week, and thank you for all the thoughtfulness on episode 100. Let's do 1,000,000, shall we? Stay good, stay close, stay connected. You're not alone. I love you.